In the category of buyer qualification, there's also the minimum income question as well. But it's okay because when you know it's a qualifying problem, you can just simply set up your T-bars and move on. So same thing. Housing expense over gross monthly income times ratio on the front, and housing expense plus long-term debt or recurring debt over gross monthly income and ratio. Okay, let's take a look at the question here. What is the minimum annual income necessary for a buyer to purchase a home with a monthly housing expense of $1,243 if the bank will qualify him using 2836 ratios? The buyer also has monthly recurring debt of $636. All this should sound familiar to you now, and it's just a matter of plugging it in. Does it make sense to you that the variable we're looking at in this one is the gross monthly income? What's the minimum monthly income? Or this says annual income, so we will annualize it once we get there. So let's see if we start plugging things in, what happens. So we have 1243 down here, housing expense given. Okay. We have the ratio on the front end of 28%, again, given, and we're looking for the GMI. So 1243 divided by 28%. And on the front end, typically just the one step is all you're going to need. So oops, I punched in the calculator wrong. 1243 divided by 0.28 tells me that he needs to make income of at least 4439 29 per month to qualify, but we haven't taken his debt into consideration yet. So let's go do that. 1243 plus 636. Now, to me, that looks like a lot of debt for somebody that doesn't have a super high income. So let's see if I'm right. All right, we add this together down here, 1243 plus 636. 1879 is how much his total debt will be. We're going to divide that by the 36%, and that'll give us the GMI. So 1879 divided by 36%. $5,219 and some change. It's like 44. Okay. Now, let me remind you, when asking a minimum income question, the answer is actually going to be the higher of the two numbers. Because remember, the bank would rather you make more money than less. So in this case, because he's got too much back-end debt, he's going to end up having to make more money. So we're going to take the 5219, we're going to multiply it by 12. You could multiply both sides by 12 if you wanted to, but clearly the one that's the biggest monthly is also going to be the biggest annual as well. So I'm only going to do the biggest monthly. I multiply that by 12, and this guy needs to make 62,633, and then it looks like there's just repeating threes after that. Okay, so to answer that question is 62, 63, and change. And then obviously one of the other possible answers would be whatever that comes out to be, 4439.29 times 12. 53, 271.48. But it's minimum income, so the answer is going to be the higher of the two. And in that last move, we simply annualize it because it asks for annual income. Okay, here's another example of the minimum income question. A couple of tricks in this one, though. How much must a buyer make per year to qualify for a loan with PI payment of $850, taxes and insurance average $180 per month? Buyer has long-term debt of only $120 for a student loan payment. Bank will use qualifying ratios 2836. So when I'm looking at this, I see a lot familiar, but there's one thing that's a little bit tricky about this one. So as usual, I set up my T-bars. All right, so housing expense over gross monthly income and ratio. Back in housing expense plus long-term debt over gross monthly income ratio. Start plugging things in. Hope something good happens. Now, I want you to notice on this first one, though, there is a strange trick. The formula asks for housing expense. Notice that we're giving you the PI and the TI payment separately. In this case, we're going to need to add them together because we have to give the formula what it wants before we're going to be able to solve it. So we're going to add the 850 PI to the 180 of the TI, and the housing expense is going to be $1,030. Okay, so I'll plug that in here, plug it in here. Now everything else should work out. Plug in our long-term debt, plug in our ratios, and after that, it should all be familiar to you. Let's see, what's that? 1,030 plus 120, so I think it's going to be 1,150. Okay, the optical illusion, it made me think it wasn't right. All right, so now let's go in here and start performing the functions. 1,030, now that we have PI and TI, divided by 28% means that he's going to need to make 36 78.57. Okay, and then on the back end, we're going to take the 1150 at the top of the T-bar. We're going to divide it by the ratio of 36% given by the bank. $3,194. And change, I think it's 44 cents. Okay. And on this problem, how much must a buyer make per year? So again, I'm going to annualize it. Now, in this particular case, remember, minimum income is going to be the higher of the two numbers. And in this case, I was pretty sure it was going to be the top number, the first number, because he didn't have a whole lot of back end debt. So in this particular case, we go back to the front end. He needs to make 3678.57. We're going to annualize it by multiplying it by 12. So in this case, he needs to make $44,000 per year. 44,142.84. And depending on whether there was a rounding issue there, we may be off by a little bit, but also on the test, they may just simply round it to a whole number or something to that effect. So the answer to this question is 44,142 is the minimum income he must make to qualify for the home that has a monthly PITI payment of $1,030. Continuing to look at the minimum income questions. And again, this is one that I robbed from one of my previous tests that I'd written. So it's going to be of the level that we would test you on. It's a minimum income question. I see that in the first sentence. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my T-bars. One of the reasons that you do so many of these is just so that you remember how to start the problem. Oftentimes, if someone starts the problem correctly, they have a real good chance of getting the answer. Qualifying the buyer, two ratios. One, his housing ratio, his debt ratio, And then the other one is going to be his total debt ratio, which will be the back end. Okay. So let's start plugging things in. Hope something good happens. In this case, notice I'm giving you the monthly payment of $865 and taxes and insurance of $150. We've seen this one before. So let's make sure we get this correct. I'm going to add just to make sure I don't accidentally mess up my numbers here. $865 plus the T&I is $1,015. His housing expense is $1,015. Remember, housing expense includes PI and TI. So boom, I plug that in there. I can also go ahead and plug it in down here as well. Okay, the lender will qualify the buyer using 2941. Now, interesting thing about this is 29 and 41, you see that in FHA loans, but it doesn't matter to you. They're just numbers, and you're just going to plug them in. Obviously, the variable that we're looking for is the gross monthly income. I'm missing one thing, and it says long-term debt, and there it is in the last sentence, $400. Okay, so down here, we actually have the 1,015 plus the 400. So that's going to be 1,415 divided by 41%. Now remember, take what the formula gives you or what the problem gives you. Don't automatically assume 2836. If it's conventional, it most likely will be 2836. But in this one, it looks like it's a different loan type. So just make sure you plug it in. 1,015 divided by 29%. It's $3,500. So based on his housing expense, he needs a gross monthly income of $3,500, but the bank hasn't taken into consideration his debt yet. So 1,415, after adding together the housing expense and the long-term debt, divided by a ratio of 41%, tells us that he could afford, or he must make, 3451.22. Again, don't worry too much about the change on that. Okay, so it's a minimum income question, and the bank is always going to require the higher of the two numbers. So when I look at these, 3,500 is the higher of the two numbers. So technically, he's going to have to make at least $3,500 per month to qualify for this house. Now, the 400 seemed like a lot of debt compared to his income, but notice the back end ratio with FHA allows so much more debt. In conventional loans, that number was 36%. So in this case, literally 5% more debt is what it allows. So as it turns out, he qualifies based on his front end ratio with a needing a monthly income of $3,500. And then let's see, minimum income for a loan with a month. And it doesn't say on here whether to annualize this number or not. On the exam, you would know from the answers whether to annualize it or whether to take the monthly income. So there it is.